The NHL trade deadline is less than 2 weeks away, so I wanted to make a video that I've made in each of the last 2 seasons where we talk about and preview each NHL team heading into the trade deadline by ranking them on a tier list. The 5 tiers that we have are buyers, conservative buyers, both, conservative sellers, and sellers. Starting off with the Anaheim Ducks, I'm going to go ahead and put them in the conservative sellers tier. It feels like this is the first time with this young core that the Ducks are over 500 this deep into a season. They're playing well right now, so I don't think it makes sense to completely blow things up and kind of pull the rug out from under this team, and let's be honest, they are past that part of the rebuild anyways. If the Ducks plan on making any big moves like trading John Gibson or Trevor Zegras, I feel like it's much more likely we see them do that in the offseason as opposed to at the trade deadline, but I feel like there's still a pretty good chance we see the Ducks make some minor moves. Maybe they're able to get a mid-round draft pick for a guy like Robbie Fabry. I think they could probably land a third or maybe even a second for a guy like Brian Dumoulin as well. The Boston Bruins are up next, and I'm going to put them in the both tier. Boston is one of the many teams that are fighting for a wild card spot in the Eastern Conference. Depth scoring has been an issue for the Bruins this season, so I wouldn't be surprised at all to see them go out and look to add one or maybe even multiple top 6 forwards. I think it's likely we see them trade Trent Frederick as well. He's in the final year of his contract, so I feel like there's a pretty good chance we see the Bruins do a bit of buying and a bit of selling at this year's deadline. Moving on now to the Buffalo Sabres, I'm putting them in the sellers tier. Players like Dylan Cousins and Bowen Byram have been mainstays on trade boards throughout the season. Jordan Greenway is a pending UFA. That's somebody I could see them trading as well. They currently sit dead last in the entire Eastern Conference. It's looking like they're going to miss the playoffs for the 14th consecutive season. It just doesn't make sense for the Sabres to buy right now. However, I will say if they do trade players like Bowen Byram or Dylan Cousins, I don't think it's going to be trades where they only get draft capital and prospects back. You have to imagine the Sabres are going to be looking for NHL ready players in return for those guys. It's similar to what I said about Anaheim though in regards to a potential Zegras and Gibson trade. I feel like if the Sabres are going to move one of or maybe even both of Byram and Cousins, it's something that'll likely happen in the offseason and not at the trade deadline. Moving on now to the Flames, I'm going to go ahead and put them in the conservative sellers tier along with the Anaheim Ducks. Calgary is just 1 point back right now of the Vancouver Canucks for the second wildcard spot in the Western Conference. In my opinion, they've been one of the more surprising teams in the NHL this season. If I had to guess, I think the Flames probably have a pretty quiet deadline. Maybe Dan Vladar gets moved to a team looking for a bit of help at the goaltending position, but I think in all likelihood the Calgary Flames have already made the biggest move they're going to make this season when they acquire Joel Farabee and Morgan Frost from the Flyers. Moving on now to the Carolina Hurricanes. This is a tough one because of the recent news regarding Mikko Rantanen. For now, I'm going to put them in the both tier. For those of you who don't know what Mikko Rantanen news I'm referring to, a few days ago on the 32 Thoughts podcast, Elliot Friedman said that if the Hurricanes aren't able to extend Rantanen, they may look at flipping him, and if they do that, they could retain an additional 50% of his salary, which would bring his cap hit down to around just $2.3 million for the rest of the season because the Blackhawks already retained 50% when he was dealt to Carolina in the first place. I'm not sure how I'd feel about it if Carolina does flip Mikko Rantanen. That is a team that is trying to win a Stanley Cup right now. They have been a perennial contender in the Eastern Conference for a long time now, and if they trade away Mikko Rantanen, in my opinion, their chances of coming out of the Eastern Conference this season take a massive hit because you're just not going to get a player in return that is on par with Mikko Rantanen, especially if Carolina flips him to a contender as a pure rental. I think Carolina should ride this out. They knew what they were getting themselves into in the first place when they traded for Mikko Rantanen. I feel like the most likely outcome with Rantanen was always going to be that he tests free agency. If the Hurricanes do end up trading him, maybe they then look to flip the assets that they got in return from Mikko Rantanen to make some additional moves. We'll see what happens, but there's no doubt about it. Carolina is definitely going to be one of the more fascinating teams to watch leading up to this year's deadline. Moving on now to the Blackhawks, they're definitely going to go down in the sellers tier. Ryan Donato, who is a pending UFA, actually leads the Blackhawks in goals this season with 19. He should be a hot commodity. There's been a lot of talk recently about a potential Seth Jones trade as well. Word is he wants to go to a contending team, a team where he has a chance to win. The Blackhawks currently sit 31st in the entire NHL. The only team beneath them right now is the San Jose Sharks. If they do end up trading away guys like Donato and Seth Jones, it should definitely improve the Blackhawks' odds on landing another first overall draft pick. And then in the offseason, in my opinion, Chicago's focus should shift to improving the roster and trying to speed up this rebuilding process a little bit. We just talked about Mikko Rantanen. If he does end up making it to unrestricted free agency, I definitely think the Blackhawks are a team that should try to sign him. Moving on now to the Blue Jackets, I'm going to go ahead and put them in the conservative sellers tier. Columbus has been one of the best stories in the entire NHL this season. They are currently tied with the Ottawa Senators at 62 points. However, Ottawa has the tiebreaker, so they're in the wildcard spot, but Columbus is right there. The big name everyone's going to be watching on the Blue Jackets leading up to the deadline is Ivan Provorov. He's a pending UFA, but it does sound like Provorov and the Blue Jackets have mutual interest in an extension. Maybe we see Columbus look to get a late round draft pick for one of their pending UFA forwards like Danforth or Olivier, but to be honest, I kind of feel like the Blue Jackets front office kind of owes it to this group to, for the most part, try and keep things intact and let them try and go on a run down the stretch and get into one of those two wildcard spots. Dallas is up next, and they're definitely going in the buyers tier. I do feel like it's likely we already seen them make the biggest move they're going to make this season when they acquired Mikael Granlund and Cody Ceci, but with Tyler Seguin on LTIR, they do still have quite a bit of cap space, so I wouldn't be surprised if they're not done. Moving on now to the Red Wings, I'm going to go ahead and put them in the both tier. I don't think the Red Wings should be in the market for any rentals, but in my opinion, they should be open to trading for players with term or players who are pending RFAs, not UFAs, that can help them down the stretch in their push for the playoffs, but also be a part of the team long term. And I also think they should be looking to shed some of the dead weight and move the Justin Hall and Vladimir Tarasenko contracts, if that's even possible. I mean, both of those guys have negative value right now, but if you can find a way to move either of those guys, I think that's honestly addition by subtraction. Moving on now to the Edmonton Oilers, they are definitely going to go in the buyers tier along with the Dallas Stars. With Evander Kane on LTIR, they have a decent amount of cap space to work with. They are limited in the draft picks they have for 2025, only having a 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th, but if the right player becomes available, I wouldn't be surprised if they look to move one of their 2026 draft picks. For a team that has Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl in their primes, they should always be looking to do anything they possibly can to improve the roster and give them the best chance at getting back to the Stanley Cup Finals. The Panthers are up next, and I think they're in a similar situation to the Edmonton Oilers. They're definitely going in the buyers tier. Florida has made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in back-to-back seasons. They are the defending Stanley Cup champions. They should be looking to improve the roster any way they possibly can, and who knows, Matt Tkachuk could end up going on LTIR, and if he does, that would obviously open up a ton of cap space and allow the Florida Panthers to be much more aggressive at this year's trade deadline. But similar to what I said about the Oilers, they are a bit limited in the draft picks they have for 2025. They don't have a pick in the first 3 rounds, so don't be surprised to see them look to move one of their 2026 draft picks in a trade. The LA Kings are up next, and this is another team that I'm putting in the buyers tier. LA is a team that I think should be looking to make a big splash at this year's trade deadline. They've lost in the first round to the Edmonton Oilers in 3 straight playoffs, and if the playoffs ended today, they would be playing guess who in the first round? The Edmonton Oilers. LA has some cap space to work with. They also have the kind of assets that I think allows them to go out and make a big splash. They have pretty much all of their draft picks in the next 3 drafts with the exception of their 2nd rounder this year. They have some intriguing prospects and young players as well that I think could be valuable trade chips. If Carolina is serious about potentially flipping Mikko Rantanen if they can't get him signed to an extension, I think that is a player the LA Kings should absolutely target. Next up, we have the Minnesota Wild, and they're the first team I'm going to put in the conservative buyers tier. Minnesota's having a great season. They currently sit 3rd place in the Central Division with 72 points in 57 games. The Wild do have a lot of cap space right now with Kaprizov on LTIR, but I don't think they're going to be using that up because Kirill Kaprizov is expected back before the playoffs. We've already seen the Minnesota Wild make a big splash this season when they traded a 1st-round draft pick for a former top draft pick in David Jiricek. If they can acquire a rental or two at the right price that they believe gives them a better chance at going deep in the playoffs this season, then that's obviously something you go out and do, but I don't think they should be looking to take on any players with term. I feel like when it comes to Minnesota, they should be focused on maintaining their cap flexibility heading into this offseason. When the bio penalties to Parise and Suter go from $14.74 million in dead cap space down to just $1.67 million, but it won't be long before they have to use up that newfound cap space as Marco Rossi is an RFA this summer. Brock Faber's extension kicks in next season, and before long, Kirill Kaprizov is going to be due for a massive extension as well. Next up, we have the Montreal Canadiens. I'm going to go ahead and put them in the sellers tier. They have came back down to earth quite a bit over the last month or so. I think most Montreal Canadiens fans would agree with me on the fact that another top draft pick wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, so I definitely think it makes sense for them to try and cash in on their pending UFAs, especially guys like David Savard and Jake Evans. Moving on now to Nashville, they are going in the sellers tier as well. This season has been a complete disaster for the Nashville Predators. Going into a full-on rebuild with the amount of money they have tied up in long-term contracts, it would be pretty difficult, but I definitely think they should at the very least try and stockpile some draft picks and future assets by trading away some players that aren't locked up to those big money long-term deals that do still have some value. Guys like Gustav Nyquist and especially Ryan O'Reilly, who is on a very team-friendly contract. New Jersey is up next, and they are definitely going in the buyers tier. They are one of the teams that were rumored to be in on JT Miller before he was dealt to the New York Rangers. The Devils are definitely in a position to go out and make a big splash. They have 3 second-round draft picks in the 2025 draft, and also an abundance of young players and prospects that could be used as trade bait. A guy like Dawson Mercer, I think, is a very likely candidate to be traded if they want to go and make a big splash just for cap reasons. The blue line is pretty crowded. We already know Simon Nemec is growing a little bit frustrated with his role within the organization, but it doesn't sound like the Devils really want to move him. So if they're set on keeping Simon Nemec around, maybe guys like Seamus Casey or Anton Siliev could be used as trade pieces. Moving on now to the New York Islanders, I'm putting them in the sellers tier because that's what I think they should do. They're kind of stuck in the middle right now. They are just 5 points back of the Ottawa Senators for that second wildcard spot, but I would label them as a long shot at best to make the playoffs this season. It would take a pretty fantastic run from them down the stretch to get in. I really think it's time for the Islanders to start worrying about their future. I'm not saying they have to go into a full-on rebuild, but I think it is definitely time for a retool. They have pending UFAs like Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri that you'd have to imagine would both fetch the New York Islanders pretty solid returns, Brock Nelson especially. A few weeks ago, there was talk about the Islanders potentially being open to moving Noah Dobson as well. If they're going to trade Dobson, I don't think they should be in any rush to do so. That's definitely something that could wait to the offseason, but when it comes to Palmieri and Nelson, I think you got to cash in on those guys right now. Holding on to them to try and push for a playoff spot, in my opinion, would be a massive mistake. Next up, we have the New York Rangers. I'm going to put them as conservative buyers. We already seen them make their big splash acquiring JT Miller. Wouldn't be surprised to see them look to add a little bit of forward depth, but definitely in the form of a rental. I can't see them taking on any more long-term money because of the fact that both Alexis Lafreniere and Igor Shesterkin's extensions kick in next season. Moving on now to the Senators. I'm going to go ahead and put them in the conservative buyers tier along with the New York Rangers. I feel like Ottawa is in a similar position to the Red Wings where they definitely shouldn't be looking to trade their first-round draft pick for a rental or anything like that. But if it's for a player with term who can help them down the stretch of this season in their push for making the playoffs, but also help them in the coming seasons, then I definitely think that's something they should consider. Maybe somebody like a Jared McCann or a Ricard Raquel could make some sense as a fit for the Senators. I think either one of those guys would really round out their top 6 nicely. Philadelphia is up next, and I'm definitely putting them in the sellers tier. They're not out of the playoff race by any means in the Eastern Conference, but that's a team that should definitely be prioritizing their future. 2 names on that roster that have came up a lot in trade talks throughout the season are Scott Laughton and Rasmus Ristolainen. I don't think there's any guarantee both players are traded at this year's deadline because neither are pending UFAs. Laughton has 1 more year left on his deal following this season, and Ristolainen has 2. So maybe one of those guys ends up being a trade candidate for this offseason or maybe even next year's trade deadline, but I do feel like there's a pretty good chance at least one of those players are moved, and I would say the most likely candidate of the 2 is Scott Laughton. Next up, we have the Pittsburgh Penguins, another team that is definitely going in the sellers tier. We already seen them make a big move when they traded away Marcus Pettersson to the Vancouver Canucks. It has been reported that Kyle Dubas is open for business, and there are very few untouchables on that Penguins roster, so don't be surprised if that roster looks quite a bit different a few weeks from now. San Jose, another team that is going down there in the sellers tier. They are dead last in the entire league. We already seen them make a pretty big move trading away Mikael Granlund and Cody Ceci to the Dallas Stars. Wouldn't be surprised to see them move pending UFA forwards like Luke Kunin and Nico Sturm, and I think a wild card for the Sharks is definitely Jake Wallman, who's obviously had a fantastic season for them. Has a cap of just $3.4 million, you have to imagine his value is pretty high right now. Seattle is another team I'm putting in the sellers tier. There's been a lot of talk this season about pending UFA forwards like Yanni Gourde and Brandon Tanev, and players with a bit of term left on their deals like Jamie Alexiak and Jared McCann have both had their names brought up in trade talks quite a bit recently as well. I think it's unlikely all four of the players I just mentioned to get traded, but at the very least, I think one or two of them will. I feel like Yanni Gourde is probably the most likely candidate to be moved. In my opinion, he is one of the best rental centermen on the market, and although Yanni Gourde is currently injured, I don't really think that's going to affect Seattle's ability to trade him and get a really nice return for him because he should be good to go for the playoffs. The St. Louis Blues are a very confusing team, in my opinion. I'm going to put them in the conservative sellers tier. There's been a lot of talk recently about them potentially trading away their captain, Braden Shen, but honestly, I can't see them doing that because this is a team that is obviously trying to compete in the next few seasons, or they wouldn't have went out and traded for a guy like Cam Fowler earlier this season. If I had to guess, I think St. Louis probably has a pretty quiet deadline. Maybe they look to move a pending UFA like Radek Faksa, but other than that, I can't really see them doing a whole lot. I'm really not buying all the Braden Shen rumors, but we'll see if I end up being wrong. Tampa Bay is up next, and they're definitely going in the buyers tier. They currently sit third place in the Atlantic Division. As long as the core of Point, Kucherov, Hedman, Vasilevsky, now you can throw Gensel in there, is intact, this is a team that's always going to be looking to improve and looking to compete for a Stanley Cup. I think they could definitely use some help in the middle six of that forward group. If they want to go big game hunting, Ricard Raquel could be an option for them, or if they want to target pure rentals, guys that may not cost as much in a trade as Ricard Raquel, I think players like Paul Mary, Jason Zucker, and Ryan Donato all make a lot of sense for Tampa Bay. Moving on now to the Leafs, they are going in the buyers tier along with the Lightning. Toronto currently sits second place in the entire Eastern Conference and first place in the Atlantic Division. The biggest need currently for the Leafs is obviously at the center position, more specifically the number 3 center spot. All season long, they've been linked to guys like Brock Nelson, Trent Frederick, Scott Lawton, Yanni Gourde, or maybe they go big game hunting and swing for the fences and get a younger player with a lot of term like Dylan Cousins. Whatever they end up doing, I definitely feel like this is a year the Leafs should be very aggressive in looking to improve the roster at the deadline, not just marginally, but significantly, because I think the Eastern Conference is wide open this season. Moving on now to Utah, I'm putting them in the conservative sellers tier. They are right there in terms of the wildcard race in the Western Conference. Definitely a long shot at this point, but they're not out of it by any means, so I don't think it makes sense for them to completely pull the rug out from under this group in their first season in Utah, but they do have some pending UFAs that could be intriguing adds for contending teams, guys like Nick Bjugstad and Oli Mata, and I'm curious to see what ends up happening with Lawson Krause. He's had a very rough season, just 8 goals in 57 games. He's served as a healthy scratch, so I could see them looking to shake up the core a little bit by trying to move that contract, but right now that may not be the easiest thing to do with the way he's playing. I'm going to go ahead and put Vancouver in the both tier. We've already seen them do a bit of both buying and selling this season, trading JT Miller to the Rangers and then flipping the first round draft pick they got for JT Miller to acquire defenseman Marcus Pettersson. I can't really see them making any more big splashes like that. I feel like it would be in Vancouver's best interest to hold on to their first round draft pick for the 2025 draft. Maybe they look at making a couple depth additions, but again, I think they're done with the big splashes for this season unless they look at trading away a guy like Brock Besser. He's a pending UFA. If the trade deadline rolls around and he's still without an extension, the Canucks have a pretty tough decision to make. Do you hang on to Brock Besser and have him a part of your push for the playoffs this season but risk losing him in free agency, or do you try and trade him? Elias Pettersson is obviously a wild card as well, but if a Pettersson trade were to happen, I think that's definitely more likely to happen in the offseason. Vegas is up next. I'm putting them in the buyers tier because, I mean, let's be real, they are always buyers. This year it might be a little bit more difficult. They're tight to the cap. They don't have a great prospect pool. They don't have a first rounder this year or next year, but if we know anything about Vegas, it's that they're going to try and improve the roster any way they possibly can, so I wouldn't be surprised if we see somebody going LTIR maybe at some point over the next week and a half. I just realized I skipped Colorado, so we'll do them now, and I'm actually going to put them in the both tier. We've already seen them make their biggest splash. It isn't going to get any bigger than a Mikko Rantanen trade, but Casey Middlestat's name has been brought up quite a bit recently. He's in the first year of a 3-year extension, and he really just hasn't been what the Avalanche were hoping he'd be this season, so I definitely wouldn't be surprised at all to see them trade Casey Middlestat to free up some cap space or just use him as salary filler as part of a package for a player. Moving on now to the Washington Capitals. They are definitely going to go in the buyers tier. The Capitals have, in my opinion, been the most surprising team in the NHL this season. They are first place in the entire league with 84 points in 57 games. You have Alexander Ovechkin chasing down Gretzky's goal record. Logan Thompson has been, I think, the clear-cut second best goaltender in the entire league this season. Lots to be excited about and be happy about if you're a Capitals fan. If you're the Capitals, you really don't know how many opportunities you have left to compete for a Stanley Cup with this Ovechkin-led core. They have first-round draft picks. They have 2 seconds in this year's draft. I really believe the Capitals front office should be doing anything they possibly can to improve on what is already a fantastic group. And now finally, finishing up the video with the Winnipeg Jets, the team that is right behind the Washington Capitals in the chase for the President's Trophy. And no surprise here, the Jets are going in the buyers tier along with the Capitals. This year very well may be the best chance the Jets have at winning a Stanley Cup with this group. Obviously, a lot of it is going to come down to what version of Connor Hellebuyck they get in the playoffs, but there's definitely some areas of the team I think they should look to improve. You know, a third pairing left shot defenseman, getting Logan Stanley out of the lineup on a consistent basis, I think would go a long way. And I also think they should be looking at adding a legit number 2 center. I'm not exactly sure who that could be. I like Nemesnikov, I like Adam Lowry, but I don't think either of those guys are, fit to be a second-line center on a true Stanley Cup contender. So that is going to wrap up today's video, ranking all 32 NHL teams on a tier list as the trade deadline approaches. As always, I want to know what you guys are thinking, so if you disagree with any of my picks, feel free to let me know which ones and let me know why down below in the comments. If you made it all this way to the end of the video and you ended up enjoying yourself, please remember to leave a like. It's the best way to let me know that you enjoyed, and it does actually help out the videos a ton. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this all year round, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you all again soon.